What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and today we're building a spaceship. That's right, I said we're building a spaceship, because this bad boy right here, the Kestros class Picket Cruiser, was fully designed by me. As with all of the ships that I've designed myself, I'm going to make the templates and instructions available for purchase, which I'll have linked below in the description. Putting this guy together took me a bit longer than I expected, mainly because it's by far the biggest and most complex of the models that I've designed, but also because it just took me a while to come up with something I liked. I knew I wanted it to be a little bit Star Destroyer, but not too much, and to have an unmistakable sense of size and weight, big, heavy, and dangerous. I started with the idea that maybe it would be something from the same manufacturer as the Atlas, one of my other ships. I wasn't really happy with any of those explorations though, and so for a while I was kind of stumped. I put the idea aside and just kind of left it to sit and fester in the back of my mind while I worked on other projects. What pulled me back in was I remembered that the UNSC ships from Halo are dope. I wanted to tap into that, so I spent some time just sketching them, trying to get a feel for what it is about them that I like so much. The little thing that finally gave me the inspiration I've been looking for was the split-nose prow. I spent a while just trying out different versions of that idea before I sketched this little guy, and I just knew that that was it. I did a little more exploring and refining the specifics, thinking about how it would look from different angles, what shape the nose would be, what kind of command tower, before I felt like I was ready to put together some parts to cut. The first few drafts were pretty janky, but once I knew how everything needed to fit, I was able to slap together this rough prototype. Once I had that, I could do some measuring to make a more refined, cleaned up version, which was this guy. It's looking pretty bland without any of the details though, so what we're going to do next is give it the proper treatment. First, I'm going to lay out all the tools that we're going to need to get this party started. A ruler and or drafting square. Hobby knife and extra blades. A pencil. Tweezers. A pair of plastic nippers. Masking tape. Sanding materials. An adhesive. You can do the whole thing with CA glue, but I prefer using Weld-on 3 for most of my styrene sticking needs. If you do use Weld-on, a basin for holding it, an eyedropper for removing it, and a brush for applying are must-haves. And then of course, there's the styrene. I'll be using two different weights for this project, some thinner 020 and thicker 040 sheets. The different sizes each have their part to play, so I've split up the templates based on the size of the styrene you'll need. The first two pages are 040, the second are 020. Before we can get to cutting any styrene though, I want to cut out all the individual little templates, making sure to leave a little edge around the sides so that we can stick it to the plastic. I have experimented with just sticking the whole page down and cutting everything at once, but I wouldn't recommend it. The more stuff you cut out, the less stable the paper is, and by the end, nothing wants to stay put. I did make one mistake here, and that is I cut all four sheets out and then put every template into one big pile, mixing up the two different weights. Not a crisis, but a pain in the butt to sort them all out, so I'd suggest doing your cutting in two parts. First one thickness, then the other. Once all the templates are good to go, cutting is pretty straightforward. Tape the template down on the plastic with some masking tape and slice along the lines. Styrene is a great material for this since all you need to do is score it, and with a little pressure, it breaks clean. Also, don't forget to label each part as you cut them out. Trust me when I say this will save you a lot of trouble. I won't lie, there's a lot of cutting to do. I recommend putting on some headphones and just getting into the groove of it. For most pieces, you have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of size, but what will be important is symmetry. I want to make sure these parts are as close to identical as I can get them. Not double checking that kind of thing at this stage is how you end up with a wonky, twisted looking model, which would suck. Here's what it looks like once all the parts are cut out. Just counting the ones included in the template, I think there's about 60 individual pieces here, which makes this, like I said earlier, the largest of all my designs by a long shot. Next, it's time to organize them all into little piles based on what number they are and get to building. I'll be using Weld-on 3 for most of the assembly, but you can use whatever adhesive is your favorite. Step number 1 is we want to attach parts 102A and B onto part 101. To make sure that they're nice and straight, I held onto a couple of offcuts with nice right angles to act as gussets along the inside. Before I put the other side on, part 104 serves a similar purpose along the back middle here. Because this is just a support, exact placement isn't super important, but you do want to make sure it's nice and snug straight up and down. Once both sides are in place and lined up nice and clean, part 103 goes on the tip here to keep it from flexing too much. Next, I'm going to put the construction aside for a moment and pull out the scoring guides. Closing off the inner surface of the prow would be a pain with a bunch of individual panels, so instead we're going to score and bend part 105 to make it fit as one whole piece. That does mean that it needs to be scored on both sides, thus the guide. Score along the top, flip it over lengthwise, then score along the bottom. When you bend along the cuts, you should end up with a shape that fits right up against the parts we assembled earlier. If you see any awkward gaps or the part doesn't quite line up how it should, no problem. Just snap off the offending part and attach it separately. Next, we'll cap off the nose with part 109 and finally put part 111 along the top. This is another piece where symmetry is super important, so make sure to use the notches along the front and back to help line it up. You might have noticed that I used CA glue on this part, and that's because I find that Weld-on doesn't do as good of a job reaching the center when you're attaching flat, wide sections together. Once that's all cured, we've finished section A. Next, we'll put together section B, which goes a lot like A, but smaller. Parts 107A and B with some gussets for support go into part 106. Part 108 gets scored and bent, then slides into place on top with maybe a little extra convincing. Part 110 goes on the end, and then we're done. Next is section C, the cargo bay. Compared to the prow, this is a lot more straightforward. Gussets go onto 202A and B, which attach to 201. I left 203 to 206 all connected here, mostly so I wouldn't lose them, but you can now do a familiar bend and attach method to make alignment easier. Speaking of alignment, the cargo bay needs to be centered on the keel. To help with this, parts 207A and B go on top, lined up with the left and right sides. They're sized just right to give enough space between for it to slide into place, but that's a step for later. Next, we're going to assemble part D, the wings on either side of the ship. The most dangerous thing to look out for here are parts 303 and 304, which are almost symmetrical, but not quite. If you look carefully here, there's a steep side along the top and a flatter side along the bottom. For both parts, the flatter side is what attaches first to part 301 along the edge. These parts don't need gussets, because they're not right angles, but also because 305 fills that role, holding them up along the end. You might need to do some wiggling to get all the corners to line up, so I recommend doing this quick before your adhesive fully cures. From there, 305 goes along the top, lining up the edges, and finally 306 fills out the middle. And then you gotta do it all again for the other side as well. Next is section E, the command tower. This part, I'll admit, is a bit simpler compared to my original notes, but I wanted to have something that was actually reproducible in styrene. That being said, I think if you want to try flexing some creative muscles, this is a great place to break from the pattern and make something up. Almost all the other parts have to fit together pretty specifically, but the tower just plops right on top. The assembly process should look pretty familiar by now. Use gussets to connect the sides to the top, then the thinner parts fill in the rest. You'll notice that I'm not connecting the two parts of the tower to one another, and that's because I want to fill in more details, and that's hard to do if they're attached. And with that, all the major sections are finished construction. Before we can put them together, though, it's time to take a Greeblie break, or maybe a Greeblie and panel line break. I've got a whole bunch of flat panel sections here that I want to use to add more details to the surface, and to do that I'm going to engrave some lines in them using my trusty tungsten carbide machinist scribe. This is similar to cutting the parts out, but it's a lot more freeform. I'm not following any set pattern, just breaking up the shape into smaller and smaller sections, trying to get it to look right to my eye. Sometimes this process leaves little burrs along the sides, but those are easy enough to slice off with a hobby knife. The last thing I'll do to add more detail is cut out notches from the sides to break up the clean lines of the edges. There are metalworking tools you can use to do this quickly called nibblers, but I've always been happy just doing it with a knife. I am keeping all the tiny offcuts here because they're going to be useful for later. For parts 405A and B, I'm going a step further than just scribing lines and actually breaking it up into multiple smaller panels. Then, once it's in parts, I give each of the individual sections their own treatment with lines and notches. This is another process that can take a while, but I think it's very meditative. Just working through the parts one at a time, adding detail. And now at last, we get to do the best part, adding Greeblies. I picked up this 1/700 scale ship a while back, and it's got some real good bits that I'm excited to start finding spots for. The inner prow sections would be a big pain to do after putting everything together, so these guys get to go first. I start by putting down a few small pieces of flat styrene just to get a more varied surface, and then start hunting for fun shapes to attach. To supplement the Greeblies, I'm also digging into my cup of tiny offcuts. You'll notice that I've got some little circles as well, which I made using a leather punch. Last, I've got this really nice flexible wire. I'm not really sure where it came from, but I think it's some kind of jewelry or beading wire. It takes to being bent really well though, and sticks in place with a little bit of CA glue. Now that all the details are on both sections, you can see why I wanted to do this before sticking them together. Next is adding details on a few other places I think deserve the attention. The command tower in particular is ripe for a lot of stuff going on. Once the smaller sections are all greebled up, it's time to start putting everything together. The cargo bay has a bit of a lip along the edge that needs to be sanded down before the panels can go on. This is worth doing on basically every section before they're assembled. And then once the panels are on, it connects right onto the main keel along the bottom. Next, the lower jaw of the keel goes right on the front here. And then parts 501A and B help hide the seam and hold it all together. After that, the wings can go on. This can be a bit tricky to get right, but I find it easiest to lay the whole thing on its back, line up the edges, and then fold them up around the cargo pod. Next is a few more panels, all of which of course are covered in panel lines. This includes part 503, which I cut into two separate pieces. The last parts to go on here are parts 605A and B, which close up the holes in the front. From here, I want to start kitbashing the main engines. I'll start with putting a big piece of styrene in the back here. This doesn't need to be precise, it's just big enough to serve as a base. I have a bunch of these plastic shot glasses, and I really like the domed shape of their base. It takes a little bit of work to free it, but once it's separated, I can put some more details in the center. This yellow thing is part of a thread spool, and the piece in the center is a tank wheel. To raise it up a bit, I'm using a piece of metal that I think was originally for lip balm, and some styrene and wire add a bit of more texture, and then it's ready to go in. A while ago I picked up these styrene tubes that are just the right size to telescope into one another. I use them to make these little smaller engines to go around the big one. Now that everything's together, I want to add some details along the edge here. Some of these are from the model ship I showed off earlier, but most are actually from an X-Wing kit. Next is the antenna array. I wanted a good variety of shapes for the spires here, so it's a mix of styrene rods and strips that I cut super thin, plus some ship parts for variety. It's not getting attached until after painting, because otherwise I will destroy it by accident. Once that's done, it's time to close up the back with part 604, a panel of course, and then put the bridge in place. The very last step, though, is adding back all those tiny little offcuts from earlier to give the surface some texture. It's easy to do with a fresh, sharp blade, just barely touching each one to pick it up, then dipping it in the Weld-on and placing it down wherever it deserves to go. This process can take a while, but it's one of my favorite parts. For extra fanciness, I've also got a sheet of photo-etched brass that were meant to go with some model ship I picked up secondhand. They needed a tiny drop of CA glue to go down, but I really like the sense of scale photo etch really gives you. And with all that, construction is done. A layer of primer is all it needs before we can get to painting. First step of painting here is I'm going to do some pre-shading along the bigger panel lines. Once that's been toned down with a base coat, I want to add more visual details with Aztecing. This piece of masking tape should be more than enough once it's been cut up into a bunch of teeny tiny rectangles. This process is a lot like putting the pips on earlier. It takes a while, but it's pretty satisfying. Unfortunately, I think the color I picked to go next was a bit too close to my base layer, or maybe I put it on too lightly. You can really only see the Aztecing when it catches the light right. If I were to do it again, I'd probably pick a different color. Once I had that all sealed off with a layer of clear coat, I went to add some decals. I've got a bunch of loose sheets from old kits, but in the end I went with pieces from the sheet that I had custom printed for an older project. After another layer of clear coat to protect the decals, it's time for my other favorite part, weathering. The paint I'm using here is just black oil paint that's been thinned down with some mineral spirits. Once it gets into all the deep cracks and crevices, pulling the messiness off the surface leaves it looking way better. You can see the difference it makes compared to the non-weathered section on the other side. Panel lines get hit with an even thinner mix, but the process is basically the same, letting capillary action do most of the work. Again, you can see how much of a difference it makes compared to the other side. For the bottom, I got a little lazy and instead of carefully pin washing the individual lines, I just smooshed paint over the whole thing. This is a lot quicker, but tends to stain the surface darker so the lines aren't quite as defined. It still works, but the result is a little less dramatic. The last thing that I want to do is add some streaking and color variation on the surface. My favorite way of doing this is just dotting the whole thing with a couple colors of oil paint and then pulling it all down in a single direction using a brush wet with thinner. A few spots get special leaky oil treatment, which is basically the same process but more precise. Finally, it's time to put the antennas on. Plastic on plastic is a much firmer hold than paint on paint, so I made sure to leave some masking tape here for the very end. And with that, we're done. Now's a good time to remind you that if you want to build your own Kestros, you can. I've made templates available on my Etsy, which is linked down below. And just to prove that this really is something you can make, I'll show off the other Kestros that I made off camera as a test. Since it was a bonus ship, I went a little wild on the paint job. As ever, if you do decide to make your own Kestros class, or any of my ships, I would love it if you shared your creation. Getting to see everyone's different interpretations and additions to my designs is the coolest thing ever. Not to mention, buying a template is the absolute best way to support my work, so I can keep doing cool stuff. That said, liking and subscribing or leaving a comment on what you think I should make next is always a close second. Some of my favorite projects have come from viewer suggestions, and I'm always on the hunt for what to do next. So if you've made it all the way to the end here, thanks for watching. A preemptive thanks for sharing your creations if you choose to do so. And with that, I'll see you next time.